As I just mentioned over on the audio version of the show, now we're very happy to be joined by Nina French, and I want to get this right. Just shared her bio. She's president of the Employer and Law Enforcement Solutions at Hound Labs, and she joins us here on the Big Bit Theory hotline. Nina, thanks so much for returning to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's get right to the heart of the matter, and I pulled up some numbers here. One of our researchers found this. So cannabis is legal in 39 states for medical use and 18 states and the District of Columbia for recreational use. How have new laws surrounding legalization of marijuana, how has that impacted all of those employers out there?
Well, so I think we're actually up to 19 in the district as of today. Which is actually a great place to start, because that is the issue, right? Laws are changing very, very rapidly. Adult use continues to expand. We continue to see a lot of the same trends where first states legalize for for medicinal use, and then they rather quickly, slowed slightly by the pandemic, but rather quickly into recreational or adult use. The challenge is that these are really largely unscripted. And so now what we're seeing are trends where the states that are coming to legalization now are looking at the laws in the states and learning two things, right? They're saying, okay, how was this successful as you implemented it in your state? And then how was it not quite so successful? And one of those things that they're trying to remedy is, how do you identify impairment, right? So with laws, for cannabis legalization, they're seeing an enormous uptick in use in those states. They're seeing it on the roadside, they're seeing it at workplaces. And so now they're saying, well, how do we introduce laws just like you that had successes, but then how do we manage it for safety, all these different places? The challenge is that word impairment. So we're seeing many of the states struggle with the introduction of the word impairment and trying to find an impairment standard. And an impairment standard for cannabis simply does not exist. There are a couple laws where they have introduced a number, but the number is not based on anything. There's no science behind the number. And that's really the challenge. We're seeing those laws sort of expand and duplicate themselves when actually they're not correct. So we don't want to clone them. They're going to cause trouble for employers, and they're going to cause trouble for safety.
Interesting indeed. And you and I, when we had a kind of a pre-production meeting, you and I talked about it. When you and I visited back in 2018, the conversation was very similar. And something else that hasn't changed is I feel like there are still people out there who might be of the opinion of, why spend all this money? Why spend all this time and effort in testing? If I'm a business owner, what are the benefits of having a pre-employment screening or testing of current employees? I know some of them seem obvious, but Nina, could you kind of detail some of them?
Right. I'm happy to. And actually, that's the foundational issue here, right? And I think people sort of do workplace drug testing because that's what you do, right? That's what we do. We do that in the United States. And so really what these laws and the opioid epidemic and cannabis legalization are forcing employers to look at is, well, why? And this ties back then to that notion of impairment. So are we trying to prove whether or not our candidate or our employees are impaired? And the answer is no. That is not why you drug test in the workplace. You drug test in the workplace because it is a proven risk mitigation tool. It's been proven that it works. And so much like a wearable technology, right? A watch that you wear that tracks how many steps you take, right? What's your blood pressure? What is your heart rate? That in and of itself doesn't guarantee you that you won't have a heart attack. or that you won't have high cholesterol. But what it does is it provides you with a leading measure that says, if I do all of these things, then when I get my physical, I believe I will be in better health. And drug testing is much the same. It's a risk mitigation and deterrence tool. So what the purpose of it is to deter use. And we've seen that use be successful. So when you looked at Quest Diagnostics, they published something called the Drug Testing Index, and they've published it forever. And when you saw it in the beginning, in the early, I guess 86, it was around a 13.1% or 13.6% overall workplace positivity rate, right? So that means of the people that they chose to test, 13.6% of them were positive for some drug that they tested for. And keep in mind, not all drugs are tested, right? But some drugs. So then we saw at the height of the opioid epidemic with cannabis legalization starting to spike, a low in like 2012 of like 3.1%. And that stood steady for a couple years. So what does that tell you? That tells you, well, we know opioids were raging. We know that cannabis use was up, but yet we saw this extraordinary low in drug testing because drug testing deters use. It doesn't fix use, but it says, if you are choosing to work, we want to maintain a safe workplace. We want to maintain a productive workplace, right? It's not just for safety sensitive. We do not want people who are touching our PII, who have access to your credit card, who are customer facing. We don't want anyone who is associated with our brand using drugs while at work. And so the programs are set up not to be indicators of impairment, and in fact cannot be indicators of impairment. That's another piece of this, right? But what they do is they deter use, and those are the leading indicators that employers can then see drop their workers' comp claims, right? They increase productivity, they drop absenteeism. All of those problems that are associated with use in the workplace are really like that scale at the end, right? That's your physical. You see that, and that's really the benefit of it.
Yeah, no doubt. And as I hear you speak there, Nina, and again, for our longtime listeners, they may recall when you stopped by the show, I think 2018 was your most recent visit. And back then, we discussed the opioid crisis. And here we are 4 or 5 years later. I think I mentioned to you the other day, I came across, and they're out there, but I came across a report saying how the opioid crisis is ongoing here in the country. So the problem is there, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. Again, we're not a political show. There are other podcasts who politicize everything. But this is kind of a segue into what you folks are doing there at Hound Labs. But there are a variety of tests out there. Everybody knows them: the urine, the blood sample, the hair, the saliva. Well, what are the limitations of those tests in summary? I know there's a list you could probably go through, but what are some of the more significant limitations?
Well, I think when it relates to cannabis, the biggest, most significant thing is that as all these laws were being passed and adult use and recreational, or we call it adult use or recreational use, but adult use started to come to a head and started to be legal in the majority of states, right? It's available for over 180 million people in the United States. There's a lot of availability, a lot of use. It's a growing industry. So what they didn't realize was that now you don't use blood in workplace. You can use that for roadside, but you can't really use that in workplace. So you look at hair. Hair simply just doesn't get in your hair anytime soon, right? It's a lifestyle measure. It looks back, but it doesn't get into your hair shaft, any drug, for a period of days, up to a week or so, right? So then you look at the two that are the most common, especially for federal workers, that's urine, and then they're looking to add oral fluids. Urine testing is a fantastic indicator of recent use. The problem is, no matter how you adjust that level, well, whether it be 15 nanograms that you're testing to or 3, that is not an indicator of recent use. And that is the challenge, right? Because there will not be a workplace impairment standard, or likely a roadside impairment standard that is based on the millions of data points that it took us to get to an impairment standard for alcohol. We need to look at a time-based measure. And although urine can pick up, and so can oral fluid, pick up these drugs very quickly, they have this long tail. So if you look at the most recent notice of proposed rulemaking from the Department of Health and Human Services, they indicate that cannabis can be found in urine for up to 67 days. It can be found in oral fluid for, depending on where you look, 24, 36, 48 hours. And so when you're looking at a legal use state, how are you going to be fair to those employees, right? When you say we want to test, this is a proven risk mitigation tool. This is going to save our company money. This is going to increase the value of our products and services. But yet, we can't differentiate between if this person is using at work or if they did an edible legally over the weekend at a party, right? And so that's the challenge. Using the methods that have been available to date, your challenge is either I have no way to prove recent use, and so some employers, not a large percentage, but some employers are looking to drop it. Well, that, you know what the outcome is going to be, right? The outcome of that means everyone who uses is going to use at your workplace. You are not solving the problem, you're ignoring the problem. If you looked at how do you apply this, this is really the story of how I came to Hound. It is, you need a new
that's a great
tool.
segue. Yeah, that's a great segue, Nina. So on that note, how is Hound Labs trying to help contribute to try to solve the problem?
Well, I mean, that's it, right? So the Mike Lynn, who's the founder, and Jenny Lynn, who's co-founder of Hound Labs, really set out with, I think, what they thought would be a sort of an easy, wasn't easy, not easy, right? How do you do it? Well, can you get a sample that proves impairment? Well, go back to that. We don't know what impairment is, right? Bodies, no matter how good your technology is, the challenge is that human bodies work differently. And again, workplace drug testing has never been about impairment, right? We set a limit. It is a policy. We enforce that policy. If you test at or above this limit, you are not allowed to come to work here, or we will take a negative employment action against you. So lots of people are getting caught up in that. So what Hound Labs did was say, well, how can we just get that recent use? And it turns out that you can do that in breath. So in breath, you can find just a limited number of hours past use, right? And that's what's important. When a company is looking to continue to test, but implement a fair policy that restricts use either immediately before or during work, they can implement a breath test. And what the breath test doesn't say is whether you are impaired or not, right? Because we don't know what that is. And we don't want to go there, because if you go there, by the way, then you start to have trouble with all the other drugs like opioids, amphetamines, all of the different drugs, because again, it's not what we do. Pre-employment testing is not about, are you impaired when you're coming to apply for the job, right? This is a policy standard that we have in place and that we adhere to in our organization. And that's really what you're looking to do with breath. You're saying you may not use for a period of hours, and define that in your policy, prior to coming to work. And you also, throughout your employment, may not use while you are at work. And we will continue to monitor that. So it sort of is that really fair standard of trust but verify, right? And so it allows employers to maintain that risk mitigation tool, but it does not, it is not a negative impact for employees who can legally use but are using outside of work.
Very good. Well, Nina, thanks so much again for contributing to this episode. Want to remind our viewers / listeners that there is actually a link to Hound Labs that will be in the description of the episode. And also, even though I covered Nina's bio, there'll also be a link to Nina's bio there as well. So on behalf of everybody here at the Big Bit Theory, Nina and our audience. Again, thanks so much for taking time to share information on what is such an important and ongoing story here in the United States and elsewhere.
Thank you very much for having me.